Hello and welcome to Module 5, which is the second module of Component 4. My name is Byron, I am a tutor at Chrysalis, and I'll be running you through this introduction today. So, today we're looking at self-defeating behaviors, CBT and behavioral approaches, and ethics. Okay, so all of these are kind of key functions for us to understand, so we'll spend some time and I might ask you to do a couple of reflections as we move through. So starting with our first definition, so this is a self-defeating behavior. So self-defeating behavior is when the behavior is concerned, compared to other courses of action, it's never the best possible course of action. Okay, so when you see with that as a starting point, that's quite a significant range of behaviors that we might be talking about. So next thing, we'll have one point being used successfully as a coping strategy. Yeah. So this thing that we've been using, at one point in time it was helpful to us and perhaps even functional. And the behavior will serve to ensure that the very fear of the consequence of the person is trying to avoid will come to pass. Yeah. So just to summarize that, the thing that we're trying to avoid as a result of employing this behavior means that that will actually happen. So that's the self-defeating component. Now, we're going to move on to this in a little bit more detail in a minute, but it's important that we recognize this is written from the individual's point of view, so your client's point of view. So it has to be self-defeating their goals. It has to be self-defeating as far as they're concerned, not you as an onlooker thinking, do you know what, life would be better for you if. Okay? So just trying to keep that in mind as we talk through the slides. So here we've got a really good example, and that might serve as a source of your own kind of personal reflections. So perhaps you have a couple of drinks at the weekend, and then you have a glass of wine each night, half a bottle of wine each night, a bottle of spirits each night, and not able to start the day without a drink. So thinking about how that kind of thing might unfold. Yeah. So initially, you've had a stressful week at work. And then, do you know what? This really helps me relax at the end of the day. And then, we might reason that, well, I've had a stressful day. This particular coping mechanism has helped me, so let me do that now. So already you can start to see, well, do you know what? That hasn't brought about what I needed, so then we would escalate. So we're using the same method, but just increasing the degree to which we do it. And then we increase the frequency, and then it starts interfering with the things that we want. So it's something that, perhaps you might be able to identify some of your own self-defeating behaviors. I mean, this one might be quite impactful. But there might be small irritations and small annoyances or different methods that you use to cope that perhaps aren't so helpful. Yeah? And your clients are going to bring those into therapy quite a lot. And you might observe some of those, but it's important at this point that we pay attention to what we've contracted to do and to what's therapeutically useful for our clients. Yeah? So self-defeating behaviors for everybody are inevitable. Okay? And you might recognize these patterns, and by all means you record them for your own recognition and your own processing of understanding the client. But in terms of what's useful for the client and what they want to work on, that's fundamental and key. Yep. So we have different categories of self-defeating behavior. So we're going to run through a couple of those now. So one is the misuse of any potential damaging substance or substances. So these are basically those substances that if we ingest them, they're going to cause us a degree of harm. Yeah. And these aren't helpful and they're not useful for the clients, and they might be counteracting the very things that they're trying to do. For example, if we use the previous example, perhaps let's say, for example, I'm stressed and I want to spend time with my children. Perhaps initially I had a couple of drinks and then, I can spend more time with my kids. I feel more relaxed. But then fundamentally, then I start getting hangovers and I stay in bed later. And then we don't spend as much time together. That's then it starts to become defeating one of the initial purposes of doing it. So that's where it becomes self-defeating. That's just one example, but I'll let you kind of run through different scenarios in your mind that you've either witnessed or that you might anticipate happening. Yep. Unbalanced attitudes. Yeah, so defensiveness, worrying, hostility, suspiciousness, perfectionism, shyness, and just going to read through the rest of the list there. These are particular things that perhaps defensiveness might have served some people well, to use that as an example in school. So by going into school, perhaps if I was defensive, I might be able to ascertain whether this is a safe group of people for me to interact with. And that at that point would have been really helpful and useful. But after a period of time, then it stops me presenting myself well in, things like this, for example. Perhaps I'm not able or confident to deliver a presentation, and that might prevent me getting a promotion, and that might lower my self-esteem, and then essentially the thing that I wanted becomes blocked by these patterns of behavior. And so again, we can see that pattern that initially it was a helpful strategy and it was probably the best thing to do, and based on the skills that you had at the time. But some of these behaviors, they're habitual, so they've been sustained over time and they've just outgrown their usefulness. Yeah. So that's actually quite a helpful thing to understand, is that it doesn't necessarily mean that this was never helpful or never useful. It's just the degree to which it's now become counterproductive. Things like sexual dysfunctions, erectile dysfunction is up there on the list for you, but perhaps I really, really want to have sex. That causes such a degree of anxiety in me that it then causes a physiological response, performance anxiety, that I'm not able to get an erection, and then we can't actually have sex. So the thing that I wanted and my anticipation of it means I can't have it. And that can be deeply distressing to a lot of clients, and it's not a space very often that people have got an opportunity to talk about that. Procrastination and or depression, which is a kind of form of strong avoidance. So this is slightly different than perhaps the others, because obviously if I procrastinate, perhaps at one point I was able to procrastinate and there was very few consequences, and maybe there was a reward attached to that. So think about how that might come about. Perhaps if I've made some quick decisions, those paid off badly, and when I've waited a little bit of time, I've managed to pull it together. But obviously if life advances, that procrastination and the window of opportunity decreases, it no longer works. Depression, kind of separating myself from other people. At some point, again, that might have been helpful and useful for a client. So again, we have this pattern of self-defeating behavior. We have to look at it for what it is, which is not, although we will talk about this a little bit later on, it's not a primary desire to do something unhelpful. So compulsive ritualistic behaviors. So these are self-defeating in excessive forms, and they are different to the rituals that we associate with life's transitions. There's a place for normal rituals in our lives, but taken to excess, these can be detrimental. So when I think of this one, I think of there used to be a tennis player. They watch. I won't name them because I think that's a little unfair. But they used to they had this ritual. They'd kiss this cross between everything, and then they'd wipe their forehead, and they'd get really frustrated and really anxious in the if that wasn't available. And actually, a normal safe presentation of kind of gentlemanliness, shall we say, turned into quite an angry expression because that's been disrupted. So the normal, initially it caused a sense of kind of ritual and poise, but then when that was disrupted, it actually kind of watched them lose quite a few points. And I was a bit younger at the time, and I used to play a game and think, well, if they don't do it fast enough, will he miss the shot? Which is a bit of a mean game, but it was quite interesting to see that it was actually quite self-defeating for them in the end. And we tend to focus on the times when it works still, and that's what sustains the behavior, right? And we might, disqualify the negative and overemphasize the positive. So that's a little bit about the categories of self-defeating behaviours, but I encourage you to do more reading, because that's, there's a wealth of literature out there, and talk to your tutors about it. Bring that discussion out in class. Lovely. So this is Podesky and Mooney's hot cross bun model, which is, I have to say, it's such a valuable model. So you can see here, there's thoughts, emotions, body sensations, and actions. So this has got such far-reaching potentialities, if you like, this model. So if you look, all the arrows interlink with one another. So if I have a particular thought, that will bring about a particular emotion. If I have a particular emotion, that will bring about a particular thought. If I do something, if I was to do, I'm not going to, but if I did 5 star jumps now, it's going to change my physical body sensations. It's going to change the way that I feel, and it's going to change my thinking. I'll be, well, why did I do that? And if you watch that, you might be thinking, oh, why did he do that? But it's really, really interesting that you can't separate any one of these facets of existence from the other. So you can't have a thought without having some form of corresponding emotion, no matter how subtle. And being able to track this through with a client in terms of understanding the function of a particular behavior, I might be able to see, well, what does it do for me? And I can disenchant it and disempower it. And then it invites the possibility of me being able to look at things differently. Could I, for example, get a similar function served by an adjustment of behavior? And then we can talk about that with our client, which is, it's not coaching, to be clear. It's being able to bring their own resources to the front and ask them what they want to do with that, as opposed to the slightly more directional idea of, okay, well, that doesn't work, let's get something else that works. That's not what we're doing at all. This model really brings light to experience. Okay, so if we look at behaviourist approaches for changing the way that we behave, so we have one model which is called systematic desensitization, and
let's go again. I think it's a desensitization.
Did I? Oh, okay. Behaviourist approaches for changing the way we behave.
If we look at.
Okay. So if we look at behaviourist approaches to changing the way we behave, we have 4 different models here. So one is systematic desensitization and in vivo exposure. So systematic desensitization, if you break that phrase down, we have systematic, which means that there's a structure to it and a system. And desensitizing means we're removing the amount of distress that the person experiences as a result of that introduction. So when we're systematically desensitizing, it's planned intervention to increase the amount of difficulty, to decrease the amount of difficulty that people experience at the same time as increasing the difficulty. So we'll bring in faculties like the ability to relax. So it's not that we're trying to shrink the problem, is that we're helping the client build their own personal resources. First of all, there's the belief component. So if you think about the thoughts, I believe that I can encounter this. So we've broken the problem down. And then we move towards things like plan. Then we move towards, let's say there was something smaller. So perhaps I can't, I've always avoided going into coffee shops, because if I went into a coffee shop, somebody might call my order out, and then I get red in the face and I have to go up and get that, So I've had variations of that kind of thing. And then we thought, well, how close to a coffee shop might you be able to get? Well, I'd be able to order a coffee perhaps on the app, and then go in and collect it. And then we can move up in kind of in gradations there. And then in collaboration and in conjunction with the client, we can plan the next steps and next stages. So it's quite an empowering model, because you're moving at your client's pace, which is why you can see that's why it's quite different from some conceptions of kind of coaching or kind of forcefulness. We're building in the idea that you can do more than this, but we do it to the degree that the client can feel safe and secure in doing that. Flooding I guess is the complete opposite. And I'd invite you to kind of think about your thoughts around that and kind of ethical considerations. But this is the idea where I take the thing that you're afraid of and I expose you to that in its raw form. And the rough underlying assumption is that there's only so much distress that you can take, and eventually you would learn that, well, you can cope with it, and then you'd move on. A bit of a risky strategy, you might think. So think about how you feel about that. You've got selective reinforcement. So this is the idea that the things that we want, we positively reinforce those. And that's kind of built into lots of strategies, behavior management strategies, reward charts, and all those kind of things. So intuitively, I think we know that those kind of things work, and it's how can we use that skillfully in sessions. So to give you some examples that kind of clients have come up with, is sometimes they've downloaded particular apps, or they've used a behavior activation chart, which is a CBT tool, and they've used those things to give themselves a little tick. You probably had that experience where you've written down that you're going to do something and you tick it, and that feels really good, and that's what we call a little small hit of dopamine, because it inspires the next action. So, and there's a sense of mastery that happens as a consequence of doing something like that. Then we have modeling. So modeling really is to produce the thing that it is that we want to bring in via demonstration. Yeah. So we can bring that in through role play. We can bring that in a variety of different ways with our clients. But the idea is that we're trying to bring the thing that we actually want to do and demonstrate that and have that acted out. So it's a really, really useful model as well. So the behaviorist approaches, although we tend to look on the course of the CBT, these ideas of behaviorism is quite important for us to kind of get a sense of. So we have different theories relating to self-defeating behaviors, and these were kind of highlighted by Baumeister and Scher in 1988. So one of them being primary self-destruction, which rests on the idea that we are in some way orchestrating our own destruction on purpose, which I guess almost speaks to the death drive, if you like, that proposed by Freud. But certainly from my reading, there's not a huge amount of evidence that kind of supports that theory. Although outwardly looking in, you can sometimes think, well, this person clearly wants that negative outcome to happen, and that's something worth kind of reflecting on in your groups and in your practice groups. Have a discussion about that. See if you can come up with different explanations rather than they just wanted everything to self-implode. To see if you can go a little bit deeper than that explanation. Then we have counterproductive strategies. So a counterproductive strategy is we intend one thing to happen, and then the strategy or the plan that we put forward actually decreases the likelihood of that happening. Yeah, and that can often be as a result. We've looked at some examples of that already, but my idea is that okay, well, this was definitely going to work because it's worked in the past. So it's kind of based largely, I suppose, on historical experiences rather than a clear dialogue and a thought-out process. So that's definitely something that we can utilize and bring into our therapy sessions using something like the Socratic dialogue that we spoke about last time. And then these trade-off patterns. So trade-off patterns are quite quite a useful idea to get your head around. So a trade-off pattern means that, okay, well, in the pursuit of this particular thing, I'm avoiding something else. Which it sounds, let's say I could have something now. So in the interest of convenience, I might have a trade-off. Well, yes, that would be better for me, but this is more convenient. Yeah. And I would get it faster. Yeah. So perhaps I want to feel relaxed. And I know that meditation or progressive muscle relaxation, whatever tool you use, I know that that would help me. But that requires convenience, opportunity. So it might be just quicker for me to grab 2 cans of lager and a packet of crisps, right? And that's something that we can definitely, that speaks to quite a lot of us. So just looking at, well, and how that kind of comes out in dialogue is, okay, well, tell me about that. You know, we can investigate the thing that you're unhappy with. We can look at the mechanics of it, and that's something that you can use in formulation, but it's something that you can bring out for the client who, although we act these things out, sometimes there's something about the dialogue that happens between the two of you that makes something that was hidden in the background come into my awareness. I mean, just to extend that idea, that there's so much stuff that we have to process on a day-to-day basis. What we're using here is almost like a searchlight, and then we shining a particular spotlight on that thing and just exploring it a little deeper. And if you think of the person-centered tradition, well, if the conditions are right with you in this relationship and I feel safe, I'm likely to move, having seen that problem, towards my own best interests. So trade-off patterns, we all do them. I would challenge you to perhaps think of at least 3 that you have, and just to recognize, well, that's okay, and then the degree to which they're helpful and the degree to which you're wanting to work on them. As we said just at the start, it's important, we're not trying to pick up every particular thing, and we're not trying to say, well, I've recognized this, I think you ought to know it. So it's using some clinical judgment about what's appropriate and what's helpful, and indeed what you've contracted for. So therapist qualities. So it is quite a good point to kind of move across to that. And that's by Norcross 2011. So a lot of what Norcross kind of writes about speaks to the core conditions. Yeah. So I have to be empathic. Yeah. And in the absence of empathy, it's very unlikely that I'm going to want to talk about what is essentially quite a sensitive subject with you. And I'd want to know that you're not going to do what other people are doing. Because a lot of self-defeating behaviors, they're not just problematic for you, they can be problematic for those around you. So they might not be invested in the same way as having an open dialogue. They might have quite a personalized conception of what they'd want to happen. So what we want to do is offer some kind of empathy and understanding, that unconditional positive regard, and we do that through kind of the exploration of the behavior, as we've just said. We've got the personal experience of the condition. So what is your lived experience of this? That's deeper than just the mechanics of how does that unfold. So how is that for you, I guess, is the key principle of that. And obviously the relational qualities that we've spoken about, those speak to the core conditions. So within the pluralistic approach, so we review past experiences and underlying factors with the client. Yeah. So the past experiences, again, remember we spoke about the stress diathesis, for example, but you're going to see this coming all the way through our sessions, and we have to understand the client as a human being, a human becoming, and a human with a past, and all those factors of the client we're working with. Then we have helping clients identify their feelings, and you think about the hot cross bond model, for example, there. I'm helping you to identify what you feel in relation to that. That requires a pause and an intentional focus, and the willingness for somebody to genuinely be interested in what you're saying. Gain awareness of a client's readiness to change. Yeah. So readiness to change is not just that I identify that this is something that's unhelpful. The degree to which I have the resources and the willingness to move forwards with that. Helping clients to weigh up costs and benefits of the behavior. So costs and benefits, we use a tool very often in CBT, so costs and benefits, but not all costs and not all benefits are made of equal size. So if I say, well, I have 20 costs, but all those costs are relatively small, and I have five benefits, and those benefits are, perhaps worth 10, 20 points each for me, then, well, you might likely find that those decisions are perhaps geared more towards the sustaining of the behavior that they don't want. So there's an exploration there of finding, well, how helpful or how useful is that strategy? So costs, benefits, and then working out how important each one of those costs and benefits are. Helping clients to look at beliefs about the behavior. Yeah. So what this behavior has happened, how do I think about it? Help clients to set appropriate and achievable goals and sub-goals. So this is really, really helpful. So when we talked about systematic desensitization, so this is a particular problem that you have, and can we break that down to what's manageable? Because that's actually compassionate, right? If I said to you something more than you can do, right, that's not helpful. And I'm not setting you what I think would be helpful to you. I have to understand you as a person, understand the outcome that you want, and I have to understand, your ability to break those goals down. And we might do that with a client in a session, is to set those goals, because that might not be something that perhaps I've done before. Maybe I might need some confidence that maybe I only experienced within the relationship that I formed with you. So a really, really powerful thing to do to set goals. So goals are like, where are we going? And in the pluralistic model, we always have something that we're moving towards. That's kind of a fundamental basis. We need to know where we're going, so then we could check that our actions are consistent, our therapeutic intervention rather, is consistent with that. It's not just a chat. We're moving towards something that the client wants. And goals are something that speak to that. And clients being able to understand how you model that within therapy, but also talking through particular tools, and you'll talk more about that in class as well. And this idea of rolling with resistance. And that speaks very much to the readiness to change. Sometimes you're going to raise something with a client and they don't want to, or they're not ready to tackle that particular issue at the time. That's by Miller and Rolnick. If I'm not ready to do something, and I'm like a dog with a bone as a therapist, that's off-putting, to put it mildly. Then it's about you and what you would like to see and how me progress. Miller and Rolnick would highlight the idea that, okay, well, if I've sensed some resistance from the client, the therapeutic relationship is key, and that's the thing where therapy lies. Let's move forwards with therapy, and let's revisit that later, so that we're not triggering things like shame or avoidance or ego defenses as a consequence. Yeah. So, just moving now towards ethics and professionalism in relation to behavioral change. So, our core responsibility as therapists is to do no harm. Yeah. To do good would be great, but at the very least is to do no harm. So when we think about the core conditions, okay, they're so vital for something that's really sensitive, because judgment in particular is not going to be particularly helpful. And a lot of self-defeating behaviors, that certainly ones that are employed as coping strategies, there's a lot of shame attached to a lot of those. So working at your client's pace is ethical and necessary. We must respect the client's need to self-direct. So it's not my process, this is the client's autonomy. So if the client decides that they want to change course, well then that's absolutely fine, but then we do that intentionally and we recontract as appropriate. At your stage of training, you'd also speak to your tutor, right? Because obviously if you've agreed one thing and you're shifting that focus, you need to check that you're still within your own competence. So a client's reason for change will not necessarily coincide with ours. Yeah. So establishing motivation. So meaning and motivation, really, really key in what will sustain it. So what I would say about that is that you see your clients for perhaps 1 hour, sometimes more, but generally 1 hour in the week. Now, I haven't done the math, but that's an awful lot of hours in your absence. So establishing motivation, what will sustain us between the sessions? If I come to these sessions and I see them as a relationship that's beneficial to my own motivation, that's really, really helpful and constructive. So the questions that we need to reflect on in order to keep those ideas moving is, do we experience frustration with a client's pace and ability to change? Yeah. If that happens, that's perfectly normal, but that's your stuff, right? And we have to separate what's the client stuff and what's your stuff. So if the client's struggling and you're struggling with the client struggling, you take that and make sense of that, and the client, well, we're there for them. Okay? Are we satisfying our need to rescue rather than the client's needs to change or not when they're ready? So rescuing, again, without kind of alluding to anything else in the course, this is something that we'll all have to kind of recognize in ourselves. But fundamentally, what we're trying to do with our clients is offer a supportive space where we can explore these problems. So, thank you for listening. I hope it's been helpful, and I hope it's given you a good background. Please do your background reading. Anything that doesn't make sense, jot it down, speak to your tutor. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. Good luck. Cheers.